When we usually hear about missing persons cases or unexplained deaths, the majority of time it involves one victim. To think that one person could have met with an unexplained or tragic end is very sad, but can often be explained in various ways. But what if it involves 5 people going missing at the same time? Here is a story that is over 45 years old, but hearing about it today is just as mystifying as it was back in 1978. Let's talk about the Yuba City Five. To begin, I will describe a little about the 5 men involved in this perplexing story. First off, we have 32-year-old Ted Weir, who was from Olivehurst, California. He was diagnosed as having a learning disability. He lived at home and had recently worked a few jobs, but quit when his family thought his slowness was causing problems. Second, we have Jack Madruga. He was 30 years old and lived with his parents in Marysville, California, and had been laid off from his job as a busboy a few months earlier. He had undiagnosed mild learning disabilities. He did, however, have his driver's license and owned a turquoise and white 1969 Mercury Montego that was his pride and joy. It is the car they would take on their fateful trip. The third man was Jackie Hewitt, 24, of Marysville, California. He also lived with his parents and was diagnosed with mild learning disabilities. Ted and Jackie were said to be inseparable. The fourth man we'll talk about is Bill Sterling, 29, from Yuba City, California. He was very close with Jack and a deeply religious man who lived at home. The last person in the group is Gary Mathias. He was 25 and from Olivehurst, California. He lived with his parents and worked for his stepfather's gardening business. He was previously in the Army but had been discharged 5 years earlier for psychiatric reasons. He was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and had, while in the Army, been known to have had violent outbursts and a few assaults. He was on the medications stelazine and Congentin twice daily for his schizophrenia, and for the last few years, reports indicate he had been doing very well. The 5 men, often referred to as boys by their families, were all good friends and shared a love of basketball. They all attended vocational rehab and were all considered high functioning. They were on a Special Olympics team called the Gateway Gators and were excited to be playing in a tournament that coming Saturday where the winner would be rewarded a week in LA, including a trip to Disneyland. They had made plans for the Friday night before to watch a basketball game. On February 24th, 1978, they all loaded into Jack's car and drove the approximately 50 miles to watch Chico State versus UC Davis. The boys were rooting for Davis, and after their team won, they climbed back into their car at about 10 p.m. to head home. First, they stopped off 3 blocks away from the game at Bears Market and bought some snacks, a few Pepsis, and some milk. They left and drove south out of Chico, presumably to head home. That was the last time that any of them would be seen together, and the last time anything they did made any sense. When Saturday morning arrived, the boys' families were shocked to discover they had not made it home the night before. This was completely out of character for them, and in the past, when going on these excursions, they would always come right back. They were all convinced something terrible had happened. They especially knew how excited the boys were to play in the Special Olympics basketball game on Saturday, which they had all now missed. By 8 p.m., the police had been notified, and the intense search for the boys was on. A few days after their disappearance on Tuesday, February 28th, a forest ranger found an abandoned car on an unpaved road near Oroville, California. It was Jack Madruga's Mercury Montego that the boys had left in that Friday night. There were basketball programs inside it, as well as remnants of the snacks they had bought at Bears Market that same night. The keys were gone, and one of the windows was rolled down. The only thing the car didn't contain was any trace of the 5 friends. The location where Jack Madruga's car was found made absolutely no sense. The boys were to head 50 miles south to the Yuba City area on their return trip. The car was found in the opposite direction of their homes, roughly a 2.5 hour drive from where they were last seen in Chico. What is also baffling is that the car was found up in the mountains of the Plumas National Forest in an elevation of 4,500 feet with 11 inches of snow around the car. Then it was thought the car may have become disabled in some way and the boys left on foot to get a ride. That turned out to not be the case. Authorities did have to hotwire the car since the keys were missing. However, the car started right up even after being in those rough elements for 3 days. It had about a quarter of a tank of gas in it, and there was some evidence of tires spinning, but it was in good working order. In fact, the 5 boys would have been easily able to push it out of the predicament it was in, even if they were under the false assumption the car was stuck. The investigators were also amazed at the shape the car was in, considering the rugged terrain it had ventured into. It had no damage to the undercarriage or the relatively low-hanging muffler. They believe the car was driven up there with some expertise, as in someone who knew the trail well or with such precision as to not damage it. Poor weather conditions in the mountains did hamper the search. Police brought in deputies, volunteers, bloodhounds, snowmobiles, horseback riders, helicopters, and airplanes, as well as four-wheel drive vehicles. The only thing they came across which might have been a clue was on March 18th when a gold-colored cloth was found tied to a tree only 1.25 miles from where the car was found. It may have been part of a jacket lining, and searchers were never able to ascertain whether it had anything to do with the 5 missing men. There were a few sightings of the boys after they went missing. Some of them seemed to be quite far-fetched, but a few were a little more noteworthy. A week after the boys disappeared, and after having viewed the missing poster, a woman said she had seen 5 men in a red 50s pickup truck who matched their description. It was at about 2 p.m. the Saturday after they were last seen in the Brownsville area of Yuba City in front of Mary's Country Store. She was a worker there and said 2 men stayed in the pickup, 2 of the men were at the phone booth, and 1 went in the store. The owner corroborated her story and also added he thinks he had seen Ted and Jackie on the following Sunday as well buying food. One sighting that has some room for doubt but did actually occur around the time of the disappearance and where the car was found, and may offer some clues, is the account of Joseph Shones. He said he was on his way to visit his mountain cabin in his Volkswagen Bug sometime after 5:30 p.m. the night the boys went missing. He was checking the snow line up near his cabin because he wanted to bring his wife and daughter up there that weekend. His car got stuck in the snow about 50 yards from where the boys' car would eventually be found. When Shones got out to try and free his car, he suffered a mild heart attack. He was in pain and decided to lay in the car with the engine and heat on for a bit to rest. He says about 11:30 p.m. he saw headlights on the road below his car. He initially claimed to have seen 2 sets of headlights, but later said he wasn't sure if there was a second vehicle. He said when he saw the lights, he got out and yelled for help, but when he did, the headlights went out and the people left back down the road together. He said it appeared to be a group of men and a woman with a baby. Then Shones claimed about 1:30 a.m. he saw flashlights shining outside his car and whistling sounds. He once again called for help, and the flashlights turned off and the people vanished. Still feeling poorly, he laid in the car until it ran out of gas, then eventually walked 8 miles to a lodge to get help. He said he passed the Mercury Montego on his way to get help, sitting empty in the middle of the road. The families were left to worry and wonder what could have happened to their loved ones. Then after the snow melted, they would get some answers, but it only left them with even more questions. On Saturday, June 4th, 1978, 100 days after the boys had gone missing, a group of bikers who were out riding in the mountains pulled up to a 60-foot abandoned forest trailer when they smelled something horrible. The window had been broken, and when they peered inside, they saw a horrific sight. It was the body of a man lying on a bunk bed with 8 sheets covering him from head to toe like a shroud. Ted Weir had now been found. Police were then alerted, and they arrived at the trailer to investigate. So many things about Ted Weir's life and death those 100 days defied logic on so many levels. The trailer was more than 19 miles from where the car had been abandoned, and he would have had to walk through snowdrifts to get there. He was found with no shoes on and his feet frozen solid. They had suffered frostbite so badly they had developed gangrene, and he would have been in a great deal of pain. The trailer appeared to have been ransacked as though someone possibly searching for something. It is also so tragic that there were so many things at Ted's disposal in and near that trailer that could have sustained his life indefinitely. There was a propane tank nearby that could have been turned on to supply heat to the trailer. There was additional clothing and blankets that he could have used. There was a nearby storage shed, and some of the rations had been taken out and consumed, roughly 36 meals, but there was also an unlocked locker near the storage shed that contained enough food for all 5 of them to live on for a year. There were matches in the trailer and plenty of reading material to start a fire. It did appear there were used matches in the sink, but the only evidence of them being used was a half-burned candle on the table next to Ted Weir's corpse. Also, on that bedside table was Ted's ring, necklace, and wallet, as well as a gold watch that no one recognized as belonging to any of the boys. Then what was, in my opinion, the most troubling aspect of this case was revealed. When Ted Weir went missing, he had been clean-shaven, yet when his remains were found, he had a full beard. That would mean, according to the coroner, that Ted had been alive for some 8 to 13 weeks after he went missing. In fact, he could have died just days before he was discovered. In addition to the facial hair growth, it was also stated that Ted had lost a startling 80 pounds in the short time between when he went missing and when he died. So Ted died of malnutrition and hypothermia when all around him was food and several things he could have used to keep warm. Once again, intense searches were conducted in hopes of finding the other 4 missing men. 2 days later, 11.4 miles from the car, the skeletal remains of Jack Madruga and Bill Sterling were found. Then 2 days after that, there was a discovery just off the same road, but only 2 miles from the trailer, was that of Jackie Hewitt's backbone. Sadly, his remains were found by his own father, who insisted on helping with the search efforts. The next day, about 100 yards downhill from the rest of the bones, his skull was located. In total, 4 of the 5 missing men were now located, but where was Gary Mathias? It was determined that Gary Mathias's shoes were found inside the Forest Service trailer where Ted's body was found. Since Ted's shoes had been removed, it is speculated that after Ted died, Gary took Ted's warmer shoes and left to go out in the elements, possibly horrified by his friend's death and wanting to get out of the trailer. Gary would have been in poor shape to try to venture and get help. He had gone a long time without his medication, and his stepfather even said he would probably be talking to himself. Gary also needed his glasses, and it was stated if he somehow had lost them, he would suffer from double vision. In the past, without his medication, Gary was known to have violent tendencies, so it's hard to know what kind of mental state he was in. Was Gary's body in the mountains with the rest of his friends, or did he somehow get off the mountain and live a bit longer undetected? Being as this case is over 45 years old, there really isn't much out there in terms of thoughts from the family members in print. There is a relative of one of the men who has posted a few things in the past years on social media that I thought I would mention. Bear in mind this is just speculation and theories, and we don't know if there's any evidence to support any of this. They said there was thought by some, the families, that the boys met with foul play. They believe they had an encounter with a town bully whom they had dealt with before and somehow were scared or forced into driving up into the mountains. There is even a rumor heard that Gary Mathias was beaten and thrown off a bridge in this encounter, and that's why he has never been found. The relative also claimed that there were baby clothes and blankets found in their car, which might corroborate Joseph Schoen's story of the woman with the baby, as well as shell casings found outside near the car. In doing some additional research since my article in 2019, and in preparation for this podcast, it seems some have been able to view the police report concerning the disappearances, so more details and theories have been brought forth. The most noteworthy thing I've discovered is concerning Joseph Schoen's, who at first appeared to have crucial information about his possible sighting of the men in the time when their actions and behavior was unknown. The police report involves witness testimony about the words and actions of Schoen's that put a different perspective on this case. It is said that Joseph Schoen's had been to 2 different bars and had been drinking the night he left to go into the mountains. He stated he was going to check on his house, but now it seems questionable that he even had a house in the mountains. When Joseph Schoen's did finally make it back to civilization after his harrowing journey, he was heard by witnesses saying something that still doesn't make sense. He simply said, "I should have done this 2 years ago." Schoen's also recounted to people that there was a car following close behind him to the point where he couldn't have turned around as he got deeper into the mountains. There was a theory that perhaps the Yuba City Five were the ones that Joseph Schoen's had talked about. He, by his own accounts, was resting in his car, whether it be a heart condition or the alcohol he had consumed earlier being the main factor. Perhaps there was some sort of an altercation where the men were frightened and headed further into the mountains. Joseph Schoen's had left to go into the mountains around 6 p.m., and the men left the basketball game around 10 p.m., so that timing could be true if the men came upon Schoen's during the time, by his account, he was resting in his car. It is also said that when Joseph Schoen's did make it back and was admitted to the hospital, he was very emotional, and it is unknown why. I will say that no one is saying that Schoen's did anything to hurt any of the 5 men, but his story did change a few times, and since he put himself very near where the men's car was found, it does deserve some further scrutiny. Another revelation that came out of the police report being circulated is rather baffling. There was a memo from the Yuba Sheriff's Department dated October 8, 2020. It reads, "Gary Mathias is believed to be a victim of foul play." It goes on to say that this case remains open as a missing person homicide case. It is in the best interest of all involved that this letter not be forwarded to the Mathias family. It is unclear what may have been uncovered and not released to indicate how or why it is thought that Gary Mathias met with foul play. Okay, now time for my thoughts. There are so many things that just don't make any sense in this case as far as the men's actions. One of the most obvious things are, why would they travel so far from their homes? The area they were found in was so remote, the chances of them accidentally taking a wrong turn and ending up there seem impossible. Also, not only did they inexplicably abandon a working vehicle and didn't walk the way they came downhill to get to civilization for help, they walk uphill deeper into the mountains in 5 to 10 foot snowdrifts. It does appear to me that Jack, Bill, and Jackie possibly died on their initial hike and never made it to the trailer. Ted and Gary appeared to have lived much longer, and I'm not sure why. They did mention a Forest Service snow vehicle had made a path to the trailer in the days before the boys went missing, so it's thought that perhaps Ted, and possibly Gary, did follow the tracks, and that's how they found the trailer. It's so hard to fathom that Ted could have endured in those conditions from 8 to 13 weeks, but the fact that Gary seems to have taken Ted's shoes and worn them seems to indicate he was alive probably as long as Ted or even longer. I can't imagine what was going through their heads. There is a quote from author Alfred Henry Lewis that states, "There are 9 meals between mankind and anarchy." Imagine the mental state they must have had going in without food for so long and having the effects of hypothermia. I'm sure rational thinking wasn't a possibility. Even being considered high functioning with regards to their learning disabilities, it was stated the men were reported to function well except if placed in a stressful situation when their behavior tended to deteriorate. This was no doubt probably the most stressful situation they had ever been in, and they just didn't know what to do. Considering the fact that the men drove away from the direction of their home and up into the mountains really does make me wonder if they were threatened or scared and attempting to flee from some situation. If Joseph Schoen's initial statement was correct, and remember he had just suffered a heart attack, so no doubt was in pain, and hallucinating those sightings or some of the details isn't out of the question, and did see 2 vehicles, perhaps the boys were being chased by the truck, and that's what made them drive so far away and drive into the mountains to try to lose whoever was behind them. Is it possible they were involved in an altercation at Bear's Market where they stopped to get snacks and fled? I do tend to think that Gary Mathias's remains are up in the mountains where his friends took their final breath. With his deteriorating physical as well as mental state being off of his medication for so long, I don't think he was thinking clearly and would have had the endurance or determination to go for help. So there you have the case of the 5 men who went missing in the mountains. This case continues to have many more questions than answers. It is sad to think that an innocent night out with good friends could have ended up so terribly. There is still hope that one day Gary Mathias's remains can be found and returned to his family. It is heartbreaking to think of the fear and uncertainty those men endured in the last days of their life. I'm sure they never imagined on their way home that night that the wrong path they took would truly turn into a detour of death. That concludes the podcast on the Yuba City 5. If you enjoyed it, please leave me a rating or review on your favorite podcast app. You can find my podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and iHeartRadio. It is one word, Lost and Found Podcast. I try to have a new podcast posted every 2 weeks. As always, you can find all of my articles as well as links to my latest podcast on my website at Lost and Found Blogs. And you can contact me via email at lostandfoundpodcast@yahoo. And remember that cold cases stay cold because their story stops getting told.